On the 20th of May, 2023, ITV released a statement about Phillip Schofield. He had just resigned from This Morning, the program he had presented for over 2 decades, following the public disclosure of an affair with a younger male colleague he had personally brought into the organization. He had lied about it to his management. He had lied about it to his colleagues. He had lied about it to his co-presenter. He had lied about it in a formal internal investigation conducted by the very company that was now releasing a statement about him. The statement described him as one of the best broadcasters of his generation. It thanked him for 2 decades of terrific television. It was warm. It was generous. It was, by almost any reasonable measure, the response of an institution that had spent 20 years investing in a relationship and was now managing the end of it in the most orderly way available to it. It was not the response of an institution that had spent the better part of a decade receiving complaints about the man it was now praising, watching those complaints disappear without consequence, conducting an internal investigation that accepted his denials, and removing from the building the people who had raised concerns while leaving him in place. It was not the response of an institution that had, when the relationship finally became untenable, offered him continuing work on other programs as a condition of his departure. But that is what ITV had done, and the statement, warm and generous as it was, told you everything about how the institution understood its own role in the story it was helping to close. This documentary is not about Phillip Schofield's personal conduct. That story has been told, and the facts of it are not in serious dispute. This documentary is about the institution that surrounded him for over 2 decades, about what ITV knew and when it knew it, about the internal culture that determined what happened to the people who raised concerns and what happened to the person those concerns were about the moment ITV had every opportunity to act and chose not to, and the calculation that drove that choice. Because the most important question this scandal raises is not what Phillip Schofield did. It is what ITV decided to do about it. And the answer to that question, assembled from the documented record, is both clearer and more institutional than the coverage of his personal failings has ever allowed it to appear. Part 1. The asset and what it was worth. To understand ITV's relationship with Phillip Schofield, you first have to understand what he represented to the institution as a commercial figure. This Morning had been running since 1988. By the time Schofield joined as a full-time presenter in 2002, it was the centerpiece of ITV's daytime schedule, a program that reliably delivered over 1 million viewers each morning and that functioned as both a revenue vehicle and a brand anchor for the network. When Holly Willoughby joined him as co-presenter in 2009, the combination proved commercially exceptional. The pair became, over the following decade, the most recognizable faces in British daytime television. Their audience was loyal, their ratings were consistent, their sponsorship value extended well beyond the program itself. Phillip Schofield was not simply a presenter on ITV's books, he was a commercial infrastructure. The advertising revenue attached to This Morning during his tenure, the sponsorship arrangements, the promotional partnerships, and the cultural visibility the program generated for the ITV brand as a whole. These were not trivial figures. They were the kind of numbers that determine how institutions think about the people who generate them. In the language of British broadcasting, Phillip Schofield was what is described as a talent. That word carries more institutional weight than its apparent simplicity suggests. Talent, in the internal culture of commercial television, occupies a category of its own, one with different rules, different expectations, and different consequences for those who challenge the people inside it. Talent generates revenue. Revenue generates institutional loyalty. And institutional loyalty, in environments built around the protection of commercial interests, has a tendency to override other considerations when those considerations become inconvenient. This dynamic is not unique to ITV. It is documented across the British broadcasting industry in the BBC's relationship with its most valuable presenters, and in the entertainment industry's management of its most commercially productive figures. The specific institutional form it takes varies. The outcome it produces does not. The people who matter commercially are the people whose version of events is believed, whose comfort is prioritized, and whose continued presence is treated as a requirement rather than a choice. Phillip Schofield mattered commercially for 2 decades. And for 2 decades, that commercial significance shaped every institutional decision ITV made about him. The culture of This Morning during Phillip Schofield's tenure has been described by multiple former employees, speaking in the years since his departure in consistent terms. It was a culture in which the hierarchy of the program was, in practice, determined not by the formal management structure, but by the proximity to its presenting talent. Schofield and Willoughby were the gravitational center around which the show's internal world organized itself. Their preferences shaped the working environment. Their relationships with producers and executives determined whose career progressed and whose did not. Their comfort was a production priority in ways that had no formal policy basis but were, in practice, understood by everyone who worked on the program. Former staff described an atmosphere in which raising concerns about the presenter's conduct was professionally dangerous in ways that did not require explicit threats or formal sanction. The culture managed itself. People understood that the program's most important relationships were the ones at its presenting core, and that anything which complicated those relationships was, by institutional logic, a problem to be resolved rather than a signal to be acted upon. This is a recognizable institutional pattern. It appears in accounts of the BBC during the Savile era and in descriptions of the management culture around other commercially significant figures in the entertainment industry. The mechanism is always the same. Formal structures exist, complaints procedures exist, HR departments exist. But the informal culture of the organization, the unwritten understanding of what is and is not safe to say, of which complaints will be taken seriously and which will be absorbed and set aside, operates alongside those formal structures in ways that, in practice, determine their outcomes. At This Morning, the informal culture produced a specific outcome for those who raised concerns about Phillip Schofield. Ruth Langsford, who had presented the program for many years and who submitted a formal complaint about his behavior, left the show. Dr. Raj Singh, This Morning's long-serving medical contributor, who had also raised concerns with management about Schofield's conduct, was removed from the program. The pattern was visible and consistent to anyone paying attention. The people who complained were the people who left. Phillip Schofield stayed. Part 3. The complaints and what happened to them. The formal record of complaints made about Phillip Schofield's conduct within ITV during his tenure is not comprehensively public. What is documented through the testimony of former employees and the accounts of those involved is sufficient to establish the general picture. Concerns about Schofield's behavior toward other presenters, staff, and contributors were raised with management on multiple occasions during his tenure. The concerns related to his conduct on set, his treatment of colleagues, and the atmosphere his behavior created in the working environment of the program. These were not anonymous complaints from unknown sources. They were formal complaints made by named individuals with established professional reputations within the organization. Ruth Langsford submitted a formal complaint to ITV about Schofield's conduct. The nature of that complaint and the specific behavior it concerned has not been fully disclosed publicly. What is documented is the outcome. Langsford's presence on the program diminished over the period following the complaint. Eamon Holmes, her husband and co-presenter, has spoken subsequently about his own deteriorating relationship with Schofield and with ITV management. Dr. Raj Singh, this morning's medical contributor for many years, also raised concerns about Schofield's behavior with management. He, too, left the program. The institutional response to those complaints followed a pattern that, once identified, is difficult to interpret charitably. The complaints were received, investigations of some kind were conducted, and the outcome in each documented case was that the person who had raised the concern found their position at the program becoming untenable, while the person the concern had been raised about continued to present the show. This pattern is not, on the available evidence, the result of the complaints being found to be without merit. It is the result of an institutional calculation about whose presence in the building was more valuable than the others. That calculation was never made explicit. It did not need to be. The culture of the program communicated it efficiently and without any formal statement of intent. What makes this pattern institutionally significant is its consistency. A single departure following a complaint might be explained in any number of ways. A repeated pattern, multiple people, multiple complaints, multiple departures, one constant, is harder to explain without reference to the institutional logic that produced it. The people who left were not peripheral figures. They were established, presenting and contributing professionals whose departures represented real costs to the program. The institution absorbed those costs because the alternative, examining seriously what had generated the complaints, was a cost it was less willing to bear. The people who left the program having raised concerns were not naive about what had happened. Several of them have spoken subsequently about the environment at This Morning, in terms that make clear they understood the institutional logic that had produced their departure. They were not surprised by the outcome. They were, in many cases, simply adding their experience to a body of knowledge about how the program treated people who challenged its most protected figures. That body of knowledge accumulated quietly for years. It circulated in the professional networks that connect people who have worked on the same programs, in the informal conversations that happen at industry events, in the WhatsApp groups through which the television industry's internal intelligence moves. It was not secret knowledge. It was available to anyone sufficiently connected to the world of British daytime television as a feature of the landscape. ITV, as the institution responsible for the program and for the people who worked on it, was not outside that landscape. It was at its center, and the knowledge that circulated within it was not inaccessible to the people in positions of institutional authority who were, formally at least, responsible for the welfare of the staff whose concerns were being set aside. Part 4. The Coming Out and What It Concealed. On the 7th of February 2020, Phillip Schofield came out as gay on live television. He sat beside Holly Willoughby on the This Morning sofa and read, or had read on his behalf, a prepared statement in which he said he was coming to terms with being gay, that he was telling his story now, and that no one had forced him out. The moment was staged with considerable care. Senior ITV management were present in the studio, an unusual arrangement that did not go unnoticed by those in the room. Journalists from The Sun were in attendance, having been briefed in advance. The formal structure of the disclosure was one of controlled narrative management, the story being released on Schofield's terms in his preferred environment, with the institutional apparatus of IT5 arranged around him in support. In the statement he read, Schofield insisted he had no secrets. He said he had always been open and honest about his feelings. He said no one was forcing him out and that this was his decision made at the right time. Every one of those claims was, to varying degrees, untrue. The relationship with the younger colleague who had been working at ITV, a relationship that Schofield would later admit had been ongoing for years, was at the moment of that statement an active secret that he had maintained through deliberate deception. The coming out was not, as it was framed, a moment of personal courage and transparency. It was, according to subsequent testimony, including from within the tabloid press, a controlled disclosure designed to get ahead of a story that was on the verge of becoming uncontrollable. The formal management of the narrative, the management team, the lawyers, the pre-briefed journalists, was not the architecture of a personal moment. It was the infrastructure of institutional crisis management. The role of ITV in this is significant. The institution was present at the moment of the controlled disclosure. It was part of the apparatus that shaped how the story was told and what version of it reached the public. Whether those within ITV who participated in that management were aware of the full extent of what was being concealed is a question the public record does not answer definitively. What the public record does establish is that the institution's response to that moment was not to examine the circumstances that had produced it, but to accommodate and amplify the controlled narrative that its most commercially significant presenter had chosen to offer. Part 5. The investigation that failed. At some point during the period in which rumors about Schofield and his younger colleague were circulating internally, ITV management conducted what has been described as an internal investigation into the allegations. The investigation involved formal interviews with Schofield and with the younger colleague. Schofield, according to subsequent accounts, denied the relationship categorically. He told management that the allegations were untrue, that they were the product of Twitter gossip and homophobia, and that he had never been in a relationship with any member of the This Morning staff. The younger colleague, in his own interview with management, also denied the relationship. He did so, by his own subsequent account, under circumstances of considerable personal pressure, a young man, relatively new to the industry, being asked to give evidence about a relationship with one of the most powerful figures in British daytime television in a building that belonged to the institution that employed them both. ITV accepted both denials and closed the investigation. This outcome is not, on its own, evidence of institutional bad faith. Investigations that produce denials from both parties face genuine evidential difficulties. The formal processes available to an employer in such circumstances are constrained. Human resources investigations are not criminal proceedings. They cannot compel testimony or access private communications. An employer who receives categorical denials from both parties to an alleged relationship is, within the formal logic of employment law, in a difficult position. But the formal logic does not account for everything. It does not account for the body of informal knowledge that had been circulating within the organization for years before the formal investigation was conducted. It does not account for the pattern of complaint and departure that had preceded it. It does not account for the institutional culture in which the investigation was conducted, a culture in which the outcome most consistent with the organization's commercial interests was also, conveniently, the outcome that the investigation produced. The investigation found what ITV needed it to find. It is possible that this was a genuine coincidence of institutional need and investigative result. It is also possible to read the available evidence and conclude that an institution that had spent years managing the situation in a particular direction was unlikely, in a formal investigation, it conducted itself to reach a conclusion that contradicted the direction in which it had been managing. Part 6. Holly Willoughby and the Question of Knowledge. Holly Willoughby's position in this story has not received the scrutiny it warrants. She was, by her own account and by the account of everyone who worked around them, Phillip Schofield's closest friend. They described their relationship in terms that positioned them as the central emotional support of each other's professional lives. They socialized together, and their families spent time together. She was one of the first people he told about his sexuality when he began the process of coming out. In the months and years before his public disclosure, the rumors about Schofield and his younger colleague were circulating within the industry with sufficient volume and consistency that they reached a significant portion of the This Morning audience through social media. They were being discussed in industry WhatsApp groups, in production meetings, and in the corridors of ITV's London studios. They were, in the language that multiple witnesses have used, an open secret in a world that Holly Willoughby inhabited every working day. She was also being contacted directly. Members of the public were tweeting at her about the rumors. Former colleagues were asking questions that related to the situation. The information environment in which she was operating, as someone embedded at the center of the program and at the center of Schofield's personal life, was not an environment from which the general outline of what was happening could easily have been excluded. Schofield has said that he lied to Holly directly when she asked him about the rumors. He told her it was all false, the product of homophobia and professional jealousy, and she accepted his account. Her subsequent statement when his departure from the program was announced was brief and notably cool, not the statement of a best friend standing unreservedly beside someone she believed had been wronged, but the statement of someone managing a professional situation with considerable care. What Holly Willoughby knew, and when she knew it, has not been publicly established with certainty. What can be said is that the idea of her complete ignorance of information that was accessible to people with significantly less access to Schofield than she had, is one of the less plausible features of a story that already contains several implausible elements. And that ITV, which had a commercial interest in the continuation of both of its most valuable presenting assets, had its own reasons for not examining that question too closely. Part 7. The non-disclosure agreement and the silence it purchased. Among the details of this case that have received insufficient attention is the non-disclosure agreement. In the aftermath of the affair becoming public, it emerged that Schofield had paid a six-figure sum to his former colleague and had required him to sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing him from speaking publicly about their relationship. Schofield's account of this arrangement was that it was paid for the young man's benefit, that the legal fees and the agreement were intended to protect his privacy and shield him from press intrusion. The alternative reading of the same arrangement is that a significantly more powerful man, with significantly greater resources, engaged expensive lawyers to create a legally binding mechanism of silence around a person whose testimony, if given freely, would have contradicted the narrative that powerful man had constructed. That this mechanism was put in place while Schofield was still denying the relationship. That it operated during the period in which ITV's internal investigation was accepting his denials. Non-disclosure agreements used in situations involving power imbalances between employers and employees or between more and less powerful individuals in professional contexts, have been the subject of significant regulatory debate in the United Kingdom since the exposure of their use in a number of high-profile abuse cases. The use of non-disclosure agreements to prevent disclosure of conduct that would be of legitimate public interest, conduct that relates to abuse of professional position or workplace misconduct, has been described by parliamentary committees and legal commentators as a misuse of a mechanism that was designed for legitimate commercial confidentiality purposes. The non-disclosure agreement in the Schofield case was not, on the available evidence, used to conceal criminal conduct, but it was used to conceal information about the conduct of a publicly prominent figure whose position of authority in a publicly regulated broadcaster raised questions of legitimate public interest. And it was used, with the involvement of expensive lawyers, by a person with significantly greater resources and institutional standing than the person being silenced. The silence it purchased lasted long enough to allow the controlled narrative of the coming out to run, the internal investigation to conclude in Schofield's favor, and the full story to remain suppressed until the young man's lawyers, paid for by Schofield, reached a point at which they could no longer maintain the fiction on their client's behalf. Part 8. The ratings calculation and what ended it. Phillip Schofield was not removed from ITV because of the affair. He was not removed because of the complaints from colleagues who had left the program. He was not removed because of the internal investigation that had accepted his denials. He was not removed because of the non-disclosure agreement or the controlled coming out, or the pattern of behavior that had made the working environment of This Morning uncomfortable for a significant number of people over a significant number of years. He was removed because the ratings fell. This is the most important fact in the institutional history of this case, and it is the fact that the warm statement from ITV on the 20th of May 2023 most conspicuously obscures. The sequence of events that produced his departure was not a sequence driven by institutional conscience. It was a sequence driven by the commercial logic that had shaped ITV's relationship with him from the beginning. When the relationship between Schofield and Willoughby became visibly fractured on screen, when the tension between them was legible enough to audiences that it began to produce jokes at award ceremonies and in the House of Commons, the ratings for This Morning began to decline. The audiences who had made the program commercially exceptional were turning off. And for an institution whose entire relationship with its most prominent presenter had been calibrated around his commercial value, a declining rating was the one development that the available institutional logic could not accommodate. It is worth being precise about what this means. ITV had, over the preceding years, received formal complaints from established professionals who had worked with Schofield. It had conducted an internal investigation into the rumors surrounding his relationship with a younger colleague. It had been present at a carefully orchestrated coming out that concealed more than it disclosed. It had managed, through the mechanisms available to it, each of these situations in a way that consistently preserved Schofield's position. The institution had, in each case, prioritized the commercial relationship over the questions those situations raised. The falling ratings changed none of those underlying facts. They changed only the commercial calculation, and it was the commercial calculation, not a moral reckoning, that finally produced the outcome that multiple complaints and formal investigations had failed to deliver. ITV offered Schofield a sweetener when they removed him from This Morning. He would continue to present the British Soap Awards. There was a new prime-time program in development with which he would be involved. They would allow him to issue a statement that described his departure as a mutual agreement rather than a dismissal. The institution managed the end of the relationship with the same commercial logic it had applied throughout. It protected what it could protect, it released what it could not hold, and it framed the whole transaction in language designed to minimize the damage to its own institutional reputation. The statement praising him as one of the best broadcasters of his generation was not a statement of institutional principle. It was a statement of institutional management. The distinction is significant. An institution that removes someone because it has finally concluded, on principled grounds, that their conduct is incompatible with the standards it claims to hold, does not accompany the removal with a tribute to the person being removed. An institution that removes someone because the commercial case for keeping them has collapsed manages the exit as smoothly as possible and says everything warm that can be said without creating legal liability. ITV said everything warm that could be said. Epilogue: What the institution owes. The story of Phillip Schofield and ITV is, at its institutional core, a familiar one. It is the story of an organization that built its internal culture around the protection of its most commercially valuable figures, that developed systems for managing the concerns raised about those figures in ways that consistently produced outcomes favorable to the institution's commercial interests, and that ultimately parted ways with its most valuable figure, not because of principle, but because the commercial case for the relationship had been exhausted. The people who paid the cost of that institutional logic were not Phillip Schofield. He left with a tribute and the continuing possibility of work within the industry that had shaped his career. The people who paid the cost were the colleagues who raised concerns and were removed from the program. The professionals whose complaints disappeared into an internal culture designed to absorb them without producing accountability. The young colleague around whose experience an expensive legal mechanism of silence was constructed, while the institution that employed both of them conducted an investigation it was never structurally positioned to resolve honestly. ITV has not accounted for its institutional role in this story in any public way. It has issued the statements that were required of it by the circumstances, conducted the reviews that the situation demanded, and updated the safeguarding documentation that provides formal cover against future claims of institutional negligence. Whether those updates represent a genuine change in the culture that produced the conditions described in this documentary, or whether they represent the updating of paperwork that institutions perform when the alternative is continued. Press scrutiny is a question that the history of institutional self-reform in British broadcasting does not answer optimistically. There is a broader question that this case sits inside. It applies to every institution that has found itself updating its safeguarding policies and issuing statements of commitment to a safer workplace. The question is whether the commercial logic that determined how ITV managed Phillip Schofield has actually changed, or whether it has simply become more careful about being visible. Commercial incentives in broadcasting have not changed. The value of presenting talent to the revenue structures of commercial television has not changed. The institutional pressure that value creates, the pressure to manage concerns in ways that protect the asset rather than examine what the concerns are actually saying, has not changed. What has changed is the language used to describe the culture. And language, as the ITV statement of the 20th of May 2023 demonstrates with considerable precision, is something institutions manage rather than speak. What can be said is that the institutional conditions that protected Phillip Schofield for over a decade were not unique to ITV or to This Morning or to the specific circumstances of one presenter's conduct. They are the predictable product of an environment in which commercial value determines institutional loyalty, in which the people with the most power are the people whose version of events is most readily believed, and in which the formal mechanisms of accountability, the complaints procedures, the HR investigations, the internal reviews, are conducted by the very institution whose interests determine their outcomes. The statement ITV, released on the 20th of May 2023, described Phillip Schofield as one of the best broadcasters of his generation. What it did not say, and what the institution has never said, is anything that acknowledges its own role in the story that preceded that statement. The warm tribute and the institutional silence are two sides of the same document. The document tells you, if you read it carefully, everything you need to know about how the institution understood its own accountability. It understood it as something to be managed, not something to be accepted.